My name is Memo Rungui from Industrial Psychology Consultants. We periodically bring Professor Hawkins to give us an economic outlook. We've done several sessions of this nature, even before the COVID lockdown. I would like to welcome Professor Tony Hawkins to this particular session. So this is how this session is going to work. We will allow Professor Hawkins to do his presentation. Then we have question and answer session at the end. We will allow people to ask questions through the chat or directly to Professor Tony Hawkins. So you will have an opportunity to ask any questions that you may have with regard to his particular presentation. Professor Hawkins, welcome to this session, and I hand over to you now to take over and do your presentation.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'd just like to start by making the point that a lot of the numbers that one has to use are pretty speculative. That is because there's a great scarcity of numbers in this economy at the present time. And we have to just work with what we have. My aim of this talk is just to try and begin by looking at where we are today in the middle of the year and project forward until the end of the year. I'm not prepared to go any further than that because the uncertainties are so great. At the moment, the economy is it's just what I've called in the handout there, the steepest short-term decline in its history. And I go back to looking at numbers till the sort of mid-1940s. GDP fell about 10% last year, close to that, probably fall another 12 to 15% this year. In other words, the economy will be about a quarter smaller by the end of 2020 than 2 years ago. If you adjust for inflation, GDP is the lowest it's been for 9 years. And before that, we have to go right back to the early 1990s to find a figure as low as the current one of around 15 billion US dollars. The graph there just shows you the peak in the late 1990s. 98 was actually the peak. Then a trough in 2008 after hyperinflation, strong growth during the GNU period, and then a very flat period until the decline of the last 18 months. Why is this happening? Well, 2 drought years, obviously, hyperinflation, collapsing currency, and now COVID. There are longer-term explanations. We haven't invested enough, either locally or foreign. We've had erratic and poorly designed economic policies. We've been in a period of economic isolation. Governance at political level has been very poor, and we have very high levels of political and country risk. Income per head, if you again adjust for inflation, it's probably below what it was in 1980 and about 1/3 below the peak in 1998. So people are worse off on average, and averages are always misleading. You must remember that. Employment is stagnant. We had a report last year by government which said there were 2.9 million people employed, 2.2 million, about 3/4, in the informal sector. Incomes are even lower there, of course, than in the formal economy. Inflation averaged 255% last year. Zimbabwe has the second highest inflation rate in the world after Venezuela. This year, so far, it's averaged 655% in the first 5 months. And that's a dramatic reflection of how much the situation has deteriorated in the course of a year. We're looking at a bit of an improvement, if you like, in the second half of the year. So we would say that something like an average for the year is something like the inflation, which is averaging 650% now, as against 250% all of last year. The assumption is that it'll slow a bit if all goes well, but that is very optimistic, I think. But the assumption is that it's going to slow down to average around 800 this year. However, I think that's got a very low probability, and a more likely outcome is much higher inflation. Basically, the exchange rate is following inflation and following the official rate. The Zimbabwe dollar theoretically was worth 100 cents at the start of last year. We then devalued by 40%. To date, we have now devalued by almost 98.5%. The local currency is now worth 1.57 US cents. So Mr. Mangudja's marvelous new $20 bill is worth about 30 cents. And you need 3 or 4 of those to buy a loaf of bread. Now, with average inflation currently of 655%, you cannot maintain a stable exchange rate. In the world as a whole, inflation is around 5%. In developing countries, that's the average. In industrial countries, Europe, North America, it's less than half of a percentage point. How can we survive with 655%? And the answer is, of course, we can't. What I've shown there is, going up until June, is the official and parallel rates. The parallel rate is the higher one, of course, as you can see. It's shot up particularly from about September last year. And the takeoff has really been severe since January, February this year, as you see. The official rate is just devaluing, particularly now under the auction. Under the auction, the official rate has devalued 60% in just 10 days. Money supply, which is a major driver of inflation, grew 50% in the first 4 months of the year. Prices over the same period increased 70%. And that explains why liquidity is so tight, because prices are rising faster than the availability of money. Even though money is growing much faster this year than last. Last year it was only growing 13%. Now it's grown about 50% already. Employment, which is an issue of critical significance, not just economically, but socially and politically and so on. Formal employment before COVID and the lockdown was about 700,000, according to the official figures. At a conservative estimate, about 50,000 of those jobs have been lost so far. But that's a very, very suspect estimate, because we don't have any figures. One of the problems, we have all these organizations representing employers and industry and commerce and so on, but they don't seem to do too much research and keep people informed, unfortunately. Informal employment is estimated at about 2.2 million. Again, this is a government estimate, but we have no way, obviously, of guessing how many jobs have been lost there. Given the nature of those jobs, it's very hard to be able to estimate anything. But we know with the closures of the combis and things like that, that there must have been a fair number of job losses. As for wage figures, those are pretty much non-existent. We do get some from Central Stats, but they are only a survey, and they don't cover everybody by a long, long way. The best wage figure we've got is that one from the Labour Force survey, which was carried out in March of 2019, so it's just a year out of date, it showed us then that the average wage was around $640 a month. That's based on the figures that it had. But only a tiny proportion of employees were actually getting that wage. The vast number of people were getting less than that. The updated figure for the end of last year, which was a guesstimate by myself, is about 1,400 because there were big wage increases last year. Today, it's probably around 2,000. But the minimum wage, as you know, is 2,500. And we know that domestic workers are getting salaries of less than 1,000 a month. I mean, that's an unsustainable situation. These are very crude estimates. They're based on those official figures and my guesswork, because I wouldn't call it more than that.